There's nothing quite like the weight of watching your children's dreams slip away because you made one impossible choice. For Darrel Wynn, that moment came when he spent their entire college fund on a broken helicopter rusting in a field. His kids were devastated. His daughter wouldn't speak to him for weeks. His son called him selfish. Neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. But Darrel wasn't chasing some foolish dream. That helicopter held a secret tied to his brother's disappearance 30 years ago, a mystery that had haunted him every single day since. What he found inside that rusted machine would do more than just answer an old question. It would change his family's life forever. But what could possibly be hidden in an abandoned helicopter for 3 decades? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've saved something extra special for you. The town of Millbrook, Nebraska, sits where the highway meets farmland, the kind of place where everyone knows your name and most of your business besides. It's a town of grain silos and church steeples, of Friday night football games and Sunday morning services. The sort of place where a handshake still means something and a man's reputation follows him like his shadow. Darrel Wynn had lived in Millbrook his entire life, all 62 years of it. His garage sat on the corner of Main and 5th, a squat brick building with Wynn's Auto Repair painted in fading letters across the front. The sign needed touching up, had needed it for years, but Darrel never seemed to find the time. He was too busy keeping the town's vehicles running, his hands perpetually stained with grease, his coveralls bearing the marks of 3 decades of honest work. Inside the garage, the smell of motor oil and old coffee mingled in the air. Darrel moved between the vehicles with the practiced ease of a man who knew his craft inside and out. He could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone, could rebuild a transmission with his eyes half closed. Folks said he had magic in his hands, but Darrel knew it was just patience and practiced 2 things he'd had plenty of time to develop. He lived in a modest house 3 blocks from the garage, a white 2-story with blue shutters that his father had built back in 1955. The lawn was kept neat, the porch swept clean, but there was a certain emptiness to the place that anyone could sense. It was a house that had once held laughter and noise, and now held mostly silence. Darrel had raised 2 children in that house, and he'd done it alone. His daughter, Cassidy, was 26, now a school teacher over in Kearney, about 40 miles west. She taught 2nd grade, and she was good at it, patient with the children in ways that reminded Darrel of his own mother. Cassidy had her mother's dark hair and sharp cheekbones, but she had Darrel's steady temperament, his quiet determination. She'd been engaged for 6 months to a decent young man named Preston who worked in insurance. They were saving for a house, trying to build something stable. His son, Trevor, was 24, working construction in Omaha. The boy had deferred college twice now, first to help Darrel when the garage had a rough year, then because he couldn't quite figure out what he wanted to study. Trevor was tall and strong, with his father's broad shoulders and his uncle's restless energy. He'd always been good with numbers, had a natural understanding of physics and engineering that Darrel wished he'd had himself. Both of them were good kids. Both of them deserved better than what life had handed them. Their mother, Linda, had left when Cassidy was 5 and Trevor was 3. Just packed her bags one Tuesday morning and drove off in her Chrysler LeBaron, leaving a note on the kitchen table that said she couldn't do it anymore, couldn't be a wife, couldn't be a mother, couldn't be trapped in a small town watching her life slip away. Darrel had read that note 100 times, trying to understand, trying to find some hint of what he could have done differently. Eventually, he'd stopped reading it and started focusing on what mattered, raising his children right. It hadn't been easy. There were mornings when he dropped the kids at daycare, worked a full shift at the garage, picked them up, made dinner, helped with homework, given baths, read stories, and collapsed into bed, wondering how he'd do it all again tomorrow. But he had. Day after day, year after year, he'd shown up and done the work, and he'd saved money. Every spare dollar went into a savings account at First National Bank, the college fund. He'd started it the week after Linda left, opening the account with $43 and a promise to himself that his children would have opportunities, would have choices, would have the education he'd never gotten. 23 years of deposits. 23 years of skipping lunches, driving old trucks into the ground, wearing clothes until they couldn't be patched anymore. 23 years of watching that balance grow, slowly but surely, until it reached $47,000. It should have been enough. Not for Harvard or Yale, but enough for state school, enough to give them a start. But both kids had deferred. Cassidy had wanted to work for a year first, get some teaching experience, make sure education was really what she wanted. Then she'd met Preston, and the wedding planning started, and suddenly buying a house seemed more practical than going back to school. Trevor had deferred because he genuinely didn't know what he wanted to study, didn't want to waste money on classes that might not lead anywhere. So the money sat there, untouched, waiting, and Darrel started thinking about his brother. Kenny had been 4 years older, the kind of big brother every kid wants, tall and confident, quick to laugh, quicker to defend. He'd joined the Army right out of high school in 1968, became a helicopter pilot, served with distinction. Darrel had been so proud of him, so certain Kenny would come home a hero and tell stories for the rest of his life. Kenny had died in 1973, or disappeared. The official story was that his helicopter had gone missing during a routine supply mission in South Vietnam. The Army had listed him as MIA, missing in action. They'd sent his personal effects home in a cardboard box, a watch, a wallet, some letters. They'd put his name on the memorial wall in Grand Island. They'd sent the family a flag, but they'd never sent a body, never provided details, never really explained what happened. Darrel had been 19 when Kenny disappeared, young enough to accept what he was told, old enough to sense something wasn't right. Over the years, that sense had grown into certainty. He'd started researching quietly in whatever spare time he had. He'd read books about the Vietnam War, about classified operations, about helicopters that went missing in places they weren't supposed to be. He'd found patterns, inconsistencies, questions no one wanted to answer. His workshop behind the garage had become a second office. Aviation manuals lined the shelves, mixed with military history books and declassified documents he'd requested through Freedom of Information Act requests. He had maps pinned to the walls, photographs of helicopters, lists of tail numbers, and squadron assignments. His friends thought it was a hobby, something to keep him busy in his retirement years, though Darrel was still 5 years from anything resembling retirement. Floyd Patterson, who ran the hardware store, would sometimes stop by with coffee and shake his head at the maps and documents. "You've got to let it go sometime, Darrel," Floyd would say, his voice gentle but firm. "Kenny's been gone longer than he was alive. You've got to make peace with it." But Darrel couldn't make peace with it. Every instinct he had, every skill he'd developed, diagnosing problems that others couldn't see, told him there was more to the story. Kenny hadn't just disappeared. Something had happened, something that someone didn't want discovered. The workshop was his sanctuary, the place where he could spread out his research and think. He'd installed a space heater for winter nights, a fan for summer afternoons. There was the old couch he'd salvaged from the curb where he sometimes fell asleep, surrounded by his brother's ghost. Cassidy worried about him. She'd said as much during their last Sunday dinner, her fork pushing pot roast around her plate, while Preston made polite conversation about interest rates. "Dad, you're spending too much time out there," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular tone of concern that reminded him so much of his own mother. "You need to be thinking about yourself, about your future. Maybe take a vacation, go see the Grand Canyon or something." Trevor had been quieter, but Darrel had caught him looking at the photographs on the workshop wall, studying his uncle's face in the old military portrait. The boy had never met Kenny, had only heard stories, but there was something in his expression that suggested he understood the pull of unanswered questions. "I'm fine," Darrel had told them both, which was partially true. He was healthy enough, strong enough, still capable of a full day's work. But fine was relative. There was a hollowness in his chest that had nothing to do with his health and everything to do with the brother he'd lost and the answers he'd never gotten. The years had been kind to Darrel in some ways, hard in others. His hair had gone mostly grey, his face weathered by time and sun and worry. He moved a little slower than he used to, felt the cold more keenly in winter. But his hands were still steady, his mind still sharp, and his determination hadn't wavered. He kept a photograph on his workbench in the garage, tucked into the frame of his tool calendar. It showed two boys in uniform, taken at Fort Rucker, Alabama, in 1969. Kenny stood tall in his flight suit, his arm around Darrel's shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera. Darrel had driven down to visit during Kenny's flight training, had watched his brother take a helicopter up for the first time, had felt a mix of pride and fear that he'd never quite been able to articulate. "Take care of yourself, little brother," Kenny had said when Darrel left to drive back to Nebraska. "And if anything ever happens to me, don't believe everything they tell you. Promise me that." Darrel had laughed it off at the time, figured Kenny was just being dramatic. Pilots had a reputation for gallows humor, for joking about crashes and close calls. But those words had come back to him 1,000 times over the years, especially after the telegram arrived in 1973 with its cold, official language, missing in action and presumed deceased, and grateful for his service. The army had been polite but unhelpful when Darrel tried to get more information. There were forms to fill out, offices to call, letters that received carefully worded non-answers. The mission had been classified. Details could not be released. The investigation was ongoing but unlikely to yield results after so much time had passed. Darrel had pushed as hard as he could, but he'd been a 19-year-old mechanic from Nebraska with no connections and no leverage. Eventually, the responses stopped coming altogether. The case was closed. Kenny was gone. But Darrel had never stopped looking. He'd learned to use computers, taught himself to navigate government databases and military archives. He'd joined online forums where veterans and their families shared information about missing service members. He'd filed dozens of FOIA requests, most of which came back heavily redacted or completely denied on grounds of national security. And slowly, piece by piece, he'd started to build a picture of what might have happened. Kenny's unit had been involved in operations that weren't officially acknowledged. There were gaps in the flight logs, missions that didn't appear in official records, helicopter tail numbers that seemed to disappear from the system entirely. Other families had similar stories, brothers and sons who'd gone missing under circumstances that didn't quite add up, official explanations that raised more questions than they answered. Darrel had compiled a list of helicopter tail numbers associated with Kenny's squadron, cross-referenced them with auction records and military surplus sales, tracked them through decades of ownership changes. Most had been scrapped or sold for parts. A few had ended up in museums. One or two had simply vanished from the records entirely. And then, 3 weeks ago, he'd found it. A government surplus auction scheduled for late autumn up near Valentine. The listing was buried in the back pages of the catalogue, barely more than a line item. 1 EA, UA, 1H helicopter, Vietnam era, non-operational, ASIS condition. But the listing included the tail number, and Darrel had recognized it immediately. It was Kenny's helicopter. Or one of them. At least one of the aircraft assigned to his brother's unit during that final deployment. Darrel had sat in his workshop for 3 hours that night, staring at the listing, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. This was it. This was the chance he'd been waiting for. The opportunity to find something concrete, some piece of evidence that might finally answer his questions. But the auction minimum bid was $40,000. He'd looked at his bank statements, at the college fund sitting untouched for 2 years now, He'd thought about Cassidy's house, about Trevor's education, about the promises he'd made to give his children better futures. And he'd thought about Kenny, about a promise made decades ago to not believe everything they told him, about a brother who'd never come home. The decision had torn him apart for days. He'd barely slept, barely eaten, playing out scenarios in his mind. He'd picked up the phone to call Cassidy a dozen times, wanting to ask her permission, wanting to explain. But he knew what she'd say. She'd say the money was for their future, not for chasing ghosts from the past. In the end, Darrel had made the choice alone. The hangar Darrel rented sat on the edge of an old airstrip outside town, a corrugated metal building that rattled in strong winds and leaked when it rained hard. It wasn't much, but it was affordable, and it was private. The helicopter had been towed there 3 days after the auction, delivered on a flatbed truck that groaned under the weight. Darrel had stood in the gravel parking lot, watching them unload it, feeling the full weight of what he'd done settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. The helicopter looked worse in person than it had in the auction photographs. More rust, more damage, more years of neglect showing in every panel and rivet. But it was real. It was here. And somewhere inside that corroded metal frame might be the answers he'd spent 30 years searching for. The first week had been the hardest. His body wasn't 20 anymore, wasn't even 40. Climbing in and out of the helicopter left his knees aching. Reaching into tight spaces made his back protest. By the end of each day, he could barely straighten up, could barely grip a wrench. But he kept going. He'd started systematically, the way he approached any mechanical problem. First, a complete external inspection, documenting every panel, every access point, every sign of damage or repair. He took photographs, made sketches, noted serial numbers and part numbers. Then he'd begun the careful process of opening inspection panels, removing floor plates, examining the internal structure. The work was slow. Everything was corroded, seized up, fighting him. Bolts snapped off, panels came away in pieces. He had to be careful. If there was evidence here, he couldn't afford to destroy it through carelessness or haste. The hangar was cold in the mornings, the Nebraska autumn, bringing frost that lingered until midday. Darrel wore layers, kept a space heater running near his work area, drank coffee from a thermos that Floyd refilled for him every morning. Floyd would stop by with the coffee and a sandwich, never asking questions, just offering quiet support in the way old friends do. "You eating enough?" Floyd would ask, and Darrel would nod, though the truth was he often forgot to eat until his hands started shaking. Cassidy still wasn't speaking to him. He'd tried calling twice, left messages that went unreturned. Trevor had sent a few terse text messages, single-word responses that made it clear he was still angry but hadn't completely cut ties. The neighbors' reactions had been harder to take than his children's silence. Darrel could feel their judgment when he stopped for gas or groceries. Mrs. Kowalski from the church auxiliary had actually crossed the street to avoid him. Old Pete Haverman, who'd been bringing his truck to Darrel's garage for 20 years, had taken it to the shop in Kearney instead. The town had decided he'd lost his mind, and maybe they were right. But then, on the 9th day, he found something. He'd been working on the pilot's area, carefully removing the seat to inspect the mounting brackets underneath. The seat was a mess, foam deteriorated, fabric rotted, springs exposed. As he lifted it away from the mounting point, something fell from behind the seat back, hitting the floor with a metallic clink. Darrel's breath caught. He set the seat down carefully and knelt, his knees protesting, searching the debris on the floor. There, half buried in old insulation and mouse droppings, a glint of metal. He picked it up with trembling fingers, brushed away the grime, and felt 30 years collapse into a single moment. Dog tags, 2 of them on a chain, the metal tarnished, but the stamped letters still legible. Kenneth Wynn, 455738842, Opos, Catholic. Darrel closed his eyes, pressed the tags against his forehead, and for the first time in years he wept. Not the quiet tears of private grief, but deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere he'd kept locked away since 1973. Kenny had been here. In this helicopter. These were his tags, hidden behind the pilot's seat in a place where they wouldn't be found during routine maintenance or inspection. Someone had put them there deliberately. Kenny had put them there. Darrel sat on the cold hangar floor for a long time, holding those tags, feeling their weight. They proved nothing, legally speaking. They didn't explain how Kenny died or why the army had hidden the truth. But they proved that Darrel's instincts had been right. This helicopter was connected to his brother. The $43,500 hadn't been wasted on a fool's errand. He was still sitting there, the tags clutched in his fist, when he heard the hangar door creak open. "Dad?" Darrel looked up, squinting against the afternoon light flooding through the door. Trevor stood silhouetted in the opening, his hands shoved in his jacket pockets, his shoulders hunched against the wind. "Trevor." Darrel's voice came out rough, raw from crying. He cleared his throat, started to stand. "Don't get up." Trevor walked into the hangar, his boots crunching on the concrete floor. He stopped a few feet away, looking at the helicopter, then at his father, then at the tags still clutched in Darrel's hand. "What did you find?" Darrel held out the tags without speaking. Trevor took them, held them up to catch the light, read the names stamped into the metal. "These are Uncle Kenny's." They were hidden behind the pilot's seat. Darrel's voice steadied as he spoke, the mechanical details giving him something solid to focus on. Not just dropped or lost, hidden, deliberately placed in a spot where regular maintenance wouldn't find them. Trevor turned the tags over in his hands, studying them with the focused attention he brought to complex problems. He'd always been like that, even as a child, needing to understand how things worked, why they were the way they were. Why would he hide them? I don't know yet. Darrel pushed himself to his feet, his knees cracking. "But Kenny told me once, before his last deployment, that if anything happened to him, I shouldn't believe everything they told me. I thought he was just being dramatic. Now I think he was trying to warn me." Trevor looked up from the tags, his expression unreadable. "You really think the government lied about how he died?" "I think something happened that they didn't want anyone to know about." Darrel took the tags back, felt their familiar weight in his palm. "These tags prove he was in this helicopter. The army said his helicopter went missing over South Vietnam during a supply run. But this aircraft has a different service history. It spent time in places the army says it was never deployed." "How do you know that?" Darrel walked to his makeshift work table, a sheet of plywood laid across two sawhorses, and picked up a folder. Inside were printouts, photocopies of documents, pages from his research. He spread them out for Trevor to see. "The tail number. I've been tracking it for years. This helicopter was part of a unit that operated in Laos and Cambodia, places where we officially had no military presence. Some of the missions it flew aren't in any official record, and at least 3 other helicopters from the same unit went missing under suspicious circumstances." Trevor studied the documents, his engineering mind processing the information. Darrel could see him working through it, connecting pieces, looking for the logic. "That doesn't prove anything by itself," Trevor said finally. "No," Darrel admitted, "but it's a start." They stood in silence for a moment, the helicopter looming behind them, the tags catching the light in Darrel's hand. "Cassidy's really angry," Trevor said quietly. "She was counting on that money for the house. Preston's parents are helping them now, and she hates it, hates feeling like she owes them." The guilt hit Darrel like a physical blow. "I know. She thinks you chose a dead man over your living children. I know that too." Trevor looked at him then, really looked at him, and Darrel saw something shift in his son's expression. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to understanding. "But you couldn't let it go," Trevor said. "Could you?" "No." Darrel met his son's eyes. "I couldn't. Kenny deserved better than what they gave him, better than a name on a wall and a story full of holes. And I promised him I wouldn't just believe what they told me." Trevor nodded slowly, He walked over to the helicopter, put his hand on the fuselage, felt the cold metal under his palm. "I've got tomorrow off," he said, "if you want help." Darrel felt his throat tighten. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Trevor turned back to him, "but Uncle Kenny was family. And if somebody lied about what happened to him, if they've been lying for 30 years, then maybe it's worth finding out why." Trevor showed up the next morning at 7, bringing coffee and breakfast sandwiches from the diner. He'd stopped shaving. Darrel noticed a few days of stubble darkening his jaw, making him look older, more like the men in Kenny's old unit photographs. They worked in companionable silence at first, Trevor's construction experience proving invaluable. He knew how to rig pulleys and leverage, how to safely dismantle structures without bringing everything down at once. What would have taken Darrel days took them hours working together. "Hand me that socket wrench," Trevor said, wedged halfway into the cargo bay. "The 3/4 inch. Darrel passed it to him, heard the grunt of effort as Trevor worked on a stubborn bolt. This was good, he thought. This working together, this shared purpose. Even if they found nothing else, even if the tags were all there was, at least they had this. Around noon, Trevor emerged from the cargo bay, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cold. He held something in his hand, a waterproof pouch, military green, sealed with what looked like wax. "Found this under the floor panels," he said, setting it carefully on the work table. It was wedged between 2 support beams, not hidden exactly, but not somewhere you'd find it by accident either. Darrel's hands shook as he picked up the pouch. It was heavier than it looked, something solid inside. He worked at the seal carefully, not wanting to damage whatever was inside. The wax cracked away. The pouch opened. Inside was a map. Not a regular map, this was military grade, printed on weatherproof paper, covered in markings and notations in what looked like grease pencil. Coordinates ran along the margins. Flight paths were marked in different colors. Symbols Darrel didn't recognize dotted various locations. Trevor leaned over his shoulder, studying the map. "Where is this?" "Southeast Asia." Darrel traced one of the marked routes with his finger. "This is the Mekong River. This area here, this is Laos, and these coordinates, they're in Cambodia. But we weren't supposed to be operating there, were we?" "Officially? No." Darrel spread the map out fully, weighing down the corners with tools. The bombing campaigns were acknowledged eventually, but helicopter operations, ground forces, that was all denied for years. The map showed multiple flight routes, some marked in red, others in blue. Certain locations were circled, some with numbers next to them, others with abbreviations Darrel couldn't decipher. In the corner, barely visible, was a stamped classification marking Secret. "We need someone who can read this," Darrel said. "Someone who understands military mapping and operational codes." Trevor pulled out his phone, started typing. "Let me ask around. I know a guy from the construction site. His dad was Army intelligence. Maybe he can point us towards someone." While Trevor made calls, Darrel photographed the map from multiple angles, documenting every marking, every notation. This was evidence, real evidence, and he wasn't going to risk losing it. An hour later, Trevor had a name: Hugh Brennan, a retired Army intelligence officer living in Lincoln. He'd agreed to meet with them that evening. They drove to Lincoln as the sun set, the map sealed back in its pouch, the dog tags in Darrel's pocket. Hugh lived in a modest ranch house on the south side of the city, the kind of place that spoke of government pension and careful budgeting. He answered the door in a cardigan sweater and reading glasses, a man in his 70s with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. "Come in. Your boy said you found something interesting." They sat at his kitchen table, and Darrel laid out the map. Hugh studied it in silence for several minutes, occasionally making small sounds of recognition or surprise. Finally, he sat back and removed his glasses. "Where did you get this?" "My brother's helicopter." Darrel explained the whole story. Kenny's disappearance, the years of searching, the auction, the discoveries. Hugh listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious. Your brother was involved in Phoenix program operations, Hugh said finally, or something adjacent to it. These coordinates here, he pointed to several circled locations, these are known Phoenix sites. Intelligence gathering, asset retrieval, sometimes wet work. Wet work? Trevor asked. Assassinations. Eliminations of high-value targets. Hugh looked at Darrel. They were classified insertions and extractions, moving people and materials that officially didn't exist. Darrel felt something cold settle in his stomach. The army told us he was flying supplies. The army told you what they had to tell you. Hugh traced one of the flight paths on the map. These operations were strictly need to know. The pilots themselves often didn't know what they were carrying or who they were transporting. They just flew where they were told and kept their mouths shut. But Kenny knew something, Darrel said. He told me not to believe everything they said. He hid his dog tags and this map in the helicopter. Hugh nodded slowly. Then he figured something out, something that made him take precautions. He pointed to one of the marked locations. This site here was compromised in early 1973. Several assets were lost. The official story was that it was enemy action, but there were rumors that someone on our side had sold information, that the operation was deliberately sabotaged. Why would someone do that? Money, politics, covering up other crimes. Hugh folded his hands on the table. The end of the war was messy, Mr. Wynn. A lot of people were trying to position themselves for the aftermath, trying to hide things they'd done, trying to profit from the chaos. Your brother's helicopter going down might have been convenient for someone. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Darrel stared at the map, at the careful notations his brother had made, at the evidence of operations that had never been acknowledged. "What do I do with this?" he asked quietly. "That depends on what you want to achieve." Hugh met his eyes. "If you want answers, you keep digging. But understand people buried this information for a reason. Some of those people are still alive, still connected, still powerful. They won't appreciate you uncovering it. I don't care about that." "You should." Hugh's voice was gentle but firm. "I've seen what happens to people who dig too deep into classified operations. Careers destroyed, reputations ruined, sometimes worse. Are you prepared for that?" Darrel thought about Cassidy, about Trevor, about the life he'd built in Millbrook. He thought about the college fund he'd already spent, the bridges he'd already burned. Then he thought about Kenny, about a brother who'd been erased from history, about 30 years of lies. "Yes," he said, "I'm prepared." Hugh studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. Then here's what you need to do. Keep looking, document everything you find, and be very careful who you tell about this." He tapped the map. "I'll make some calls, see if I can find out more about these operations. But Mr. Wynn, if you find proof of what I think you're going to find, if you can prove your brother was killed to cover up illegal operations, that's going to be a bombshell. It's going to change your life in ways you can't predict." "It already has," Darrel said quietly. They drove back to Millbrook in darkness, Trevor at the wheel, Darrel lost in thought. The map sat between them, a piece of paper that somehow contained whole worlds of secrets and lies. "Dad," Trevor said as they pulled into town, "I'm taking a leave from work. However long this takes, I'm helping you see it through." Darrel looked at his son, saw the determination in his profile, the set of his jaw that reminded him so much of Kenny. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. They had the tags, they had the map, and they had each other. It was a start. The work became methodical, almost ritualistic. Every morning, Darrel and Trevor would arrive at the hangar as the sun broke over the flat Nebraska horizon. They'd start with coffee, planning the day's work, deciding which section of the helicopter to tackle next. Trevor had moved back home, sleeping in his old bedroom, the walls still decorated with posters from his high school years. It felt strange at first, his son living under his roof again after years of independence, but also right. Somehow, they'd eat breakfast together, drive to the hangar together, work side by side until darkness forced them to stop. The helicopter was revealing itself slowly, like a puzzle where each piece led to another question. They documented every inch of the exterior, removed panels and plates, examined the engine compartment and transmission housing. Trevor had rigged up better lighting, run extension cords for power tools, organized their findings in labeled boxes. Floyd stopped by most days, bringing lunch or just checking in. He never asked too many questions, just offered quiet support in his steady way. Other townsfolk were less understanding. Darrel had lost 3 regular customers at the garage. The pastor had stopped returning his calls about the church fundraiser. He could feel the town's judgment settling over him like a fog. But he also noticed something else. A few of the older veterans had started coming around. Men who'd served in Vietnam, who understood that not everything about that war had been honest or straightforward. They'd stand in the hangar entrance, hands in their pockets, looking at the helicopter with expressions that mixed nostalgia and pain. "My brother flew Hueys," one of them said, a man named Garrett with a limp and weather-beaten face. Never talked much about what he saw, but sometimes at night he'd have dreams. Wake up shouting coordinates and call signs. These men didn't think Darrel was crazy. They understood that some questions needed answering, even decades later. It was on a cold morning in late October, frost coating the grass outside the hangar, that Trevor made the next discovery. He'd been working in the tail section, examining the area around the tail rotor assembly, when he called out, "Dad, you need to see this." Darrel set down his wrench and walked to the back of the helicopter. Trevor was crouched in the tail boom, his flashlight illuminating something metallic wedged into a small access panel. "There's a tube here," Trevor said. "It's sealed. Looks like it was deliberately placed." They worked together to extract it, a cylindrical aluminum container about the length of a rolling pin, capped at both ends. The metal was tarnished but intact, the seals still holding. Darrel's hands trembled as he carried it to the work table. He'd found artifacts before the tags, the map, but something about this tube felt different, heavier somehow, weighted with significance. He worked at the cap carefully, not wanting to damage whatever was inside. The seal resisted, then gave way with a soft pop. Inside was a rolled piece of paper, protected by the airtight container. It was a letter. Darrel unrolled it carefully, his vision blurring as he recognized the handwriting. Kenny's handwriting, the same careful print he'd used in birthday cards and postcards home. Asterisk, Darrel. Asterisk, asterisk. If you're reading this, something happened to me. I hope you never find this letter. Hope I'm home telling you stories over a beer. But if you are reading it, then you need to know the truth. Asterisk, asterisk. The missions they're sending us on aren't what they claim. We're not flying supplies. We're transporting cargo that nobody wants to talk about, moving people who don't officially exist, doing things that will never appear in any report. Asterisk. Asterisk. Last week, we flew into Cambodia to extract someone. They told us it was an intelligence asset. But the cargo we brought back, I saw inside one of the crates when they were loading. Money. American dollars. Millions of them, packed in neat stacks. Asterisk. Asterisk. I asked questions. Bad idea. Got called into the CO's office and told that asking questions was hazardous to my health. Not my career, my health. They weren't subtle about it. Asterisk. Asterisk. I'm scared, little brother. Not of the enemy, but of our own people. I've seen things, heard things. There are operations within operations, money changing hands, people getting rich while soldiers die. Asterisk. Asterisk. I'm documenting everything I can. If something happens to me, if my helicopter goes down and they tell you it was enemy fire or mechanical failure, don't believe it. Look for the proof. I'm hiding it where I can. hoping someone will find it someday. Asterisk. Asterisk. Tell Mom and Dad I love them. Tell them I died doing my duty, even if the truth is more complicated than that. Asterisk. Asterisk. Take care of yourself. And if you can, find out what really happened. Don't let them bury the truth with my body. Asterisk. Asterisk. Your brother, Kenny Asterisk. The paper shook in Darrel's hands. Trevor read over his shoulder, his breathing shallow. Dad, Trevor whispered. He knew. He knew they were going to kill him. Darrel couldn't speak. He reread the letter, his brother's words burning into his mind. Kenny hadn't died in a random accident or enemy fire. He died because he'd seen too much, knew too much, asked too many questions. And for 30 years, the people responsible had gotten away with it. We need to take this to Hugh, Trevor said. He needs to see this. But Darrel shook his head. Not yet. Kenny said he was documenting everything. This letter mentions proof, evidence. If it's here, we need to find it first, all of it. Then we'll know exactly what we're dealing with. They worked with renewed intensity over the following days. The letter had changed everything, transformed their search from curiosity to mission. They knew now that they weren't just looking for answers, they were looking for evidence of crimes, of conspiracy, of murder dressed up as combat loss. Darrel found himself thinking about Kenny constantly. His brother had been 24 when he died, just 2 years older than Trevor was now. Had been scared, had known he was in danger, but had kept flying anyway because that was his duty. Had tried to leave a trail, hoping someone would follow it. And Darrel had. After 30 years, he'd finally followed it. Cassidy called one evening as Darrel sat in his workshop. The letter spread out before him. He almost didn't answer, wasn't sure he could handle her anger right now. Dad. Her voice was softer than he expected. Trevor told me what you found. Cassidy. Don't. She cut him off gently. Just listen. I've been angry at you. I still am. A little. But Trevor sent me pictures of Uncle Kenny's letter, and I read it, and I understood something. Darrel waited, his heart pounding. You didn't just throw away our future on some crazy obsession, she continued. You were keeping a promise. To your brother. And maybe that's more important than a house or a degree. Maybe some things matter more than money. Your education matters, Darrel said quietly. Your future matters. I know. But so does the truth. She paused. I'm coming home this weekend. I want to see the helicopter. I want to see what Uncle Kenny left behind. After they hung up, Darrel sat in the darkness for a long time, holding the phone, feeling something unknot in his chest. His daughter was coming home, his son was sleeping upstairs, and his brother's voice, silent for 30 years, was finally being heard. The truth was coming. Whatever the cost, whatever it took, the truth was finally coming. Cassidy arrived on Saturday morning, driving her Honda Civic down the dirt road to the hangar. Darrel watched her park, saw her sit in the car for a long moment before getting out, steeling herself. She looked tired, he thought, tired and older than 26 should look. The teaching job was demanding, the wedding planning was stressful, and he'd added to her burdens by taking away the security she'd counted on. Hi, Dad, she said, and hugged him. Not a long embrace, not quite forgiveness. But it was something. Trevor emerged from the hangar, wiping his hands on a rag, and the three of them stood there awkwardly for a moment, a family that had been fractured trying to figure out how to fit back together. Show me, Cassidy said finally. They walked her through everything. The helicopter itself, imposing in the dim hangar light, the dog tags, which she held carefully, tracing her fingers over Kenny's name, the map with its cryptic markings, and finally, the letter. She read it twice, her expression shifting from concentration to shock to something like grief. When she finished, she folded it carefully and handed it back to Darrel. They killed him, she said. It wasn't a question. We think so, Darrel replied. Or let him die. Or covered up how he really died. We're still trying to understand exactly what happened. Cassidy walked around the helicopter, running her hand along the fuselage, and Darrel saw her seeing it differently now, not as the thing that had stolen her future, but as her uncle's tomb, his final testament. "What else are you looking for?" she asked. "Kenny wrote that he was documenting everything," Trevor explained. "This can't be all of it. There has to be more." They showed her the areas they'd already searched, the panels they'd removed, the systematic grid they'd drawn up to track their progress. Cassidy studied it with her teacher's analytical eye, seeing patterns, asking questions. "What about the black box?" she asked suddenly. "Don't helicopters have those? Flight recorders?" Darrel and Trevor exchanged glances. They'd discussed it, but the truth was, they didn't know enough about helicopter systems from that era to know where such a device would be located, or if this aircraft had even been equipped with one. "Commercial aircraft have them," Darrel said, "but I'm not sure about military helicopters from the 70s. The technology was different then." "We should find out," Cassidy said. She pulled out her phone, started typing. Within minutes, she'd found technical manuals, forum discussions, diagrams. "Look, some military helicopters were equipped with crash-survivable flight data recorders. They were testing them during Vietnam. If this was a helicopter involved in classified operations, they might have wanted that extra documentation." Trevor leaned over her shoulder, reading. "Says here they were usually mounted near the transmission or in the tail boom, somewhere protected." "We've been through the tail boom," Darrel said. "Found the letter there, but nothing else." "What about the transmission area?" Cassidy asked. They spent the next hour examining the transmission housing, a complex assembly of gears and drive shafts mounted above the cargo bay. It was one of the areas they'd avoided, so far difficult to access, requiring the removal of multiple components, risky if something was still under tension. But with three of them working together, it became manageable. Trevor handled the heavy lifting, his construction-trained muscles making quick work of seized bolts. Cassidy organized tools, held flashlights, read out instructions from the technical manual she'd found. Darrel applied his mechanics knowledge, understanding how the pieces fit together, where stress points would be, how to disassemble without causing damage. They worked through lunch, through the afternoon, as autumn light slanted through the hangar windows and turned gold, then orange, then red. And then, as the sun touched the horizon, Trevor's wrench hit something that rang with a different tone. "There's something here," he said. "Behind this mounting bracket, it's not standard, it's been added." They worked more carefully now, aware they might be close. The bracket came away slowly, revealing a custom-built compartment welded to the transmission housing. Inside was a rectangular metal box, secured with screws that had been sealed with what looked like epoxy. Darrel's heart hammered as they extracted it. The box was heavy, solid, with military markings stamped into the metal. On one side, stenciled in faded paint, "Flight Data Recorder." "Oh my God," Cassidy whispered. "Kenny really did it. He saved the evidence." They set the box on the work table like it was made of glass. The seals were intact, the screws still tight. Whatever was inside had been protected from the elements, from time, from anyone who might have wanted to destroy it. But Darrel didn't open it. "Not yet. We need Hugh," he said. "We need someone who knows how to handle this, how to extract the data without damaging it. This is beyond what we can do here." He called Hugh that night, explained what they'd found. Hugh's voice was tight when he responded. "Don't open it. Don't even try. Those recorders are delicate, and the data storage medium might have degraded. You need a specialist." He paused. "I know someone. Used to work for NTSB, investigated military crashes. She's retired now, lives in Lincoln. If anyone can recover data from a recorder that old, it's her. Will she help us?" "I'll ask. But Mr. Wynn, Darrel, you understand what this means, don't you? If that recorder contains evidence of what happened to your brother, if it proves the government lied or covered up the circumstances of his death, you're holding dynamite. Some very powerful people spent a lot of effort making sure that information stayed buried. I know, Darrell said, but Kenny risked everything to preserve it. The least I can do is make sure it sees the light. The next 2 weeks were agony. Hugh arranged a meeting with the retired investigator, a woman named Gloria Hartley, who lived in a modest house in Lincoln. She was in her late 60s, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, and she handled the flight recorder with the reverence of someone who understood what it represented. "This is a CVR cockpit voice recorder," she said, examining it, "combined with basic flight data capability. They installed these on some helicopters involved in special operations, wanted documentation in case something went wrong." She looked up at Darrell. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to hide this. That suggests they knew it contained information worth hiding. Can you recover what's on it?" "Maybe. The technology is old. The medium has been exposed to temperature changes and possibly moisture despite the sealing. But I have equipment. I have experience." She met his eyes. "This will take time. Weeks, possibly months. And I can't promise anything." "Whatever it takes," Darrell said. While they waited, life continued in its strange new pattern. Darrell had mostly stopped taking work at the garage, living off savings, while he focused on the helicopter. Trevor had exhausted his leave and had to return to work, but he came to the hangar every evening and all weekend. Cassidy drove up from Kearney when she could, usually bringing dinner, staying to help with whatever needed doing. The call came on a Wednesday evening in late November. Darrell was in his workshop, organizing the documents they'd found, when his phone rang. Gloria's name appeared on the screen. "I've got it," she said without preamble. The audio recovered. "And Darrell, you need to hear this. Tonight, if possible." He called Trevor and Cassidy immediately. Trevor arrived within an hour, having left his construction site mid-shift. Cassidy called Preston, told him she wouldn't be home, and drove straight from school. They met at Gloria's house as darkness settled over Lincoln. The three of them crowded into her small dining room that had been converted into a makeshift laboratory. Gloria had equipment spread across the table, oscilloscopes, audio interfaces, computer monitors displaying waveforms. In the center sat the flight recorder, connected by various cables to her equipment. "Before I play this," Gloria said, her voice serious, "you need to understand what you're about to hear. This is raw audio from the cockpit during what appears to be your brother's final flight. It's not easy to listen to. There are sounds of combat, of fear, of men dying. Are you prepared for that?" Darrell nodded, his mouth too dry to speak. Trevor and Cassidy moved closer to him, the three of them forming a tight circle. Gloria pressed play. Static at first, then voices cutting through the interference. Kenny's voice, calm and professional, calling out altitude and airspeed. Other voices, responding his co-pilot, his crew chief. The rhythmic thump of rotor blades, providing a constant backdrop. "LZ is hot," someone said. "We've got tracers at 9 o'clock. Roger that. Evasive maneuvers," Kenny's voice. Still calm, but with an edge now. More static. The sound of the helicopter banking hard. Then another voice, unfamiliar, with an accent that sounded American but not quite right. "Stay on course. We need to reach the pickup point." "Negative," Kenny replied. "We're taking fire. I'm not risking my crew for—" "That's an order, Captain." "Stay on course." A pause. Then Kenny again, his voice different now, harder. "Since when does cargo give orders to pilots?" Darrell's breath caught. Cassidy grabbed his arm. The recording continued. Sounds of arguing. The unfamiliar voice, insisting they complete the mission. Kenny refusing to fly his crew into a kill zone. Then a new voice, crackling over the radio. "Redbird 3, you are ordered to proceed to coordinates provided. Authentication code Delta 79er. Negative, Command. We have hostile fire and no support. Requesting extraction cover. Redbird 3, you will proceed as ordered or face court-martial." Another pause. Darrel could hear the anger in his brother's breathing, picked up by the cockpit microphone. Fine. But this is on record. We're not supposed to be in this sector. The cargo we're carrying isn't medical supplies. And you're sending us into a hot LZ with no support. Someone better have answers when we get back. If you get back, Captain, you'll keep your mouth shut about what you've seen. That's also an order. The recording continued. The helicopter flying, the tension palpable in every word exchanged. Then the unfamiliar accented voice again. 3 minutes to the drop zone. The shipment needs to be intact. What shipment? Kenny's co-pilot asked. I thought we were extracting personnel. Change of plans. We're delivering cargo. Nobody told us about cargo. You don't need to know. Just fly the aircraft. Darrel heard his brother's voice, quiet but clear. Johnson, check the cargo bay. Tell me what we're actually carrying. Sounds of movement. A long pause. Then Johnson's voice, shocked. Captain, these are weapons crates, and there's something else, money, American currency, a lot of it. What the hell? Kenny's voice rose. Command, we were briefed for a personnel extraction. Nobody said anything about arms or cash. Redbird 3. Maintain radio silence and proceed to drop coordinates. Negative. I want to know what we're carrying and where it's going. The accented voice cut in, cold now. You complete the mission and forget everything you saw. Understand? No, Kenny said. I don't understand. I don't understand why we're flying weapons to an unauthorized zone. I don't understand who you are or why you're giving orders to American military. And I definitely don't understand why there's $2 million in unmarked bills in my cargo bay. Static. Then the radio voice again, but different now, threatening. Captain Wynn, you're making a mistake. Complete the mission. Land at the coordinates. Deliver the cargo, or there will be consequences. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. People who ask too many questions about this operation don't live long enough to ask more. The cockpit went silent except for the rotor noise. Darrel could imagine his brother making a decision, weighing his options, choosing his course. Johnson, document everything in the cargo bay. Take pictures if you can. Harrison, that must have been the co-pilot, get on radio to battalion, tell them we have a situation, request immediate guidance. Captain, I can't get through. Our frequency is being jammed. Jammed? By who? Unknown. But it's deliberate. Someone doesn't want us talking to command. The accented voice again. Last chance, Captain. Land at the coordinates or an explosion. Loud, violent, shaking the aircraft. Alarms began screaming. We're hit, Harrison shouted, taking fire from the ground. From where? I don't see any enemy positions. I don't know. The fire is coming from, oh God, it's coming from our own coordinates. The LZ is firing on us. Kenny's voice, struggling to control the aircraft. Mayday, Mayday, Redbird 3 taking heavy fire, we're going down. Another explosion, metal tearing, screams. The accented voice, calm amid the chaos. Should have followed orders, Captain. Then a sound like nothing Darrel had ever heard, the sound of his brother's helicopter breaking apart in midair, the sound of men dying, the sound of murder dressed up as combat loss. The recording ended. The dining room was silent. Cassidy was crying, her face pressed against Trevor's shoulder. Trevor's jaw was clenched so tight Darrel could see the muscles jumping. Gloria sat frozen, her hand still on the playback controls. They shot him down, Darrel said, his voice distant, disconnected. Our own people. They shot down an American helicopter because Kenny saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Gloria nodded slowly. That's what it sounds like. The weapons, the money, the unauthorized operation. Your brother stumbled onto something illegal, probably CIA run, and when he refused to cooperate, they eliminated him. But the recorder, Trevor said. Why didn't they recover it? Why let it stay in the helicopter? Maybe they thought it was destroyed in the crash, Gloria said. Or maybe they recovered the obvious recorders but didn't know about this one. Your brother hid it well. Darrel barely slept that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing Kenny's voice over and over. Asterisk. Should have followed orders, Captain. Asterisk. The cold acknowledgement of murder preserved on magnetic tape for 30 years. By morning, he'd made his decision. They gathered again in his workshop, Trevor, Cassidy, Floyd, and Hugh, who'd driven down from Lincoln after Gloria called him with the news. The flight recorder sat on the workbench like an accusation. We have to go public, Darrel said. Kenny died trying to expose this. We can't let it stay buried. Hugh leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. I understand the impulse, but you need to think carefully about this. The people involved in that operation, if they're still alive, they have power, resources, connections. They've kept this secret for 30 years. They won't take kindly to it being exposed. Let them come, Trevor said. We have the evidence. Evidence that implicates the CIA in illegal arms dealing and the murder of American service members, Hugh replied. Do you understand how many people would be threatened by that? How far they might go to keep it quiet? Then what do you suggest? Cassidy asked. We just put it back in the helicopter and pretend we never found it? No. Hugh held up his hand. I'm saying you need to be smart about this. You need to protect yourselves legally and physically. You need multiple copies of that recording in multiple locations. You need to contact the right journalists, the ones who have the resources and credibility to investigate properly. And you need to be prepared for the backlash. Floyd spoke up, his voice quiet. He's right, Darrel. This is bigger than you thought, bigger than any of us. You're going to need help. Over the next week, they built their strategy carefully. Hugh contacted a journalist he knew from his intelligence days, Phyllis Kendrick, who'd made her career investigating military cover-ups and government corruption. She'd broken stories about Abu Ghraib, about black sites, about operations that the government insisted didn't exist. Phyllis drove to Millbrook on a grey December morning, her rental car kicking up dust on the road to the hangar. She was in her 50s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. She listened to their story without interrupting, examined the evidence with professional skepticism, and finally listened to the flight recorder audio with her hands folded on the table. When it finished, she sat in silence for a long moment. This is real, she said finally. This is a legitimate story, and it's going to explode when it breaks. How long will it take to verify? Darrel asked. Weeks, maybe months. I'll need to corroborate everything, talk to other veterans from that unit, find documentation about the operation, verify the recorder's authenticity, get experts to authenticate the voices. The government will claim it's fake, that you manufactured it. I need to make the story airtight before we publish. We'll help however we can. Phyllis nodded. I'll need access to everything you've found, and I'll need you to be prepared for what comes after publication. Congressional hearings probably, lawsuits possibly, media attention definitely. Your lives are going to change. They already have, Cassidy said softly. While Phyllis worked on verification, other families began reaching out. Hugh had mentioned the discovery in some veteran circles, careful not to reveal too many details, but word spread. Families of other missing helicopter crews started calling, emailing, asking if Darrel had found anything about their loved ones. There were more of them than Darrel had realized. Dozens of families who'd been told their sons and brothers and fathers had died in routine missions, who'd lived with questions and doubts for decades. One was a woman named Patricia Granger, whose brother had disappeared 3 weeks after Kenny. Another was Roy Callahan, whose son had been listed as Mia from the same squadron. They came to Millbrook, saw the helicopter, heard the recording with Darrel's permission. Their grief and anger mirrored his own. They told us Jeffrey died in a mechanical failure, Patricia said, tears streaming down her face. 30 years I believed that. 30 years of thinking it was just bad luck, just one of those tragic accidents, and now you're telling me he might have been murdered too? I don't know, Darrel said honestly, but I think there's a pattern. Too many helicopters lost, too many families given incomplete answers. If we can prove what happened to Kenny, maybe we can find out what happened to the others. The community of families grew. They shared information, compared official stories, found inconsistencies and gaps. What had started as Darrel's personal quest for his brother's truth became something larger, a movement to expose decades of lies and recover honor for the forgotten dead. But there was danger, too. Darrel started noticing things, a car parked down the street from his house that hadn't been there before, phone calls where no one spoke when he answered. His garage was broken into one night, though nothing was taken, just papers disturbed, files rifled through. "They're trying to intimidate you," Hugh said when Darrel told him, "making sure you know you're being watched." "Good," Darrel replied, his jaw set. "Let them watch. Let them know I'm not stopping." But when Trevor's truck was vandalized and Cassidy received threatening emails at her school account, the danger became real in a way that made Darrel's blood run cold. This wasn't just about him anymore. His children were at risk because of choices he'd made. "We can stop," he told them one evening, the three of them sitting in his living room. "I can bury the evidence again. Tell Phyllis we've changed our minds. You two don't have to be part of this." "Don't even think about it," Cassidy said firmly. "Uncle Kenny died for this truth. We're not letting him down now." Trevor nodded agreement. "Besides, we're already in this. Backing out now wouldn't make us any safer. They know what we found." Floyd organized community support. Other veterans in Millbrook, men who understood the bonds of service and sacrifice, started taking shifts, watching Darrel's house and the hangar. They were old men, most of them, but they were determined. No one was going to threaten one of their own. The local VFW post held a fundraiser to help with legal fees and security costs. The town that had judged Darrel so harshly a few months ago was rallying around him now, understanding finally that he wasn't crazy, he was right. In early January, Phyllis called with news. "I've verified everything. The recorder is authentic, the voices match, the operational details check out. I've found 3 other families with similar stories, and I've got sources inside the Pentagon willing to confirm off the record that covert operations in that region were more extensive than officially acknowledged." "So you're ready to publish?" "Almost. I want to give the government a chance to respond officially. And I want to time this right, get multiple outlets on board so they can't bury it. Give me 2 more weeks." The story broke on a Tuesday morning in late January. Phyllis had coordinated with 3 major news outlets, simultaneously: the Washington Post, the New York Times, and 60 Minutes. By noon, Kenny's story was everywhere. Cold War cover-up. Missing helicopter crews were sacrificed in illegal CIA operations, read the Post's headline. The Times went with decades of lies. Family's quest exposes military murder. 60 Minutes promised a full investigation in Sunday's episode. Darrel's phone started ringing at 6 in the morning and didn't stop. News crews arrived in Millbrook by mid-morning, satellite trucks lining Main Street, reporters knocking on doors. The town that had been a quiet backwater became, for a brief moment, the center of national attention. Floyd had prepared for this, coordinating with the local sheriff to manage the chaos. They set up a press area at the hangar, controlled access, made sure Darrel and his family had space to breathe. The press conference happened at 2 in the afternoon. Darrel stood before a cluster of microphones, the restored helicopter behind him, his children on either side. He'd dressed in his best shirt, shaved carefully that morning, but his hands still trembled as he held Kenny's dog tags. "My name is Darrel Wynn," he began, his voice rough but steady. 30 years ago, my brother Kenny disappeared during what we were told was a routine mission in Vietnam. For 30 years, my family lived with questions. We were told his helicopter went missing, that he was declared MIA, that there were no recoverable remains, no clear answers about what happened. The cameras clicked and whirred. Reporters scribbled in notebooks. Darrel continued, 6 months ago, I spent my children's college fund to buy this helicopter at a government auction. My family thought I'd lost my mind. My neighbors thought I was chasing ghosts. But I knew. He explained the discoveries methodically. The dog tags, the map, the letter, and finally, the flight recorder that proved Kenny and his crew had been murdered to cover up an illegal operation. My brother died because he saw something he wasn't supposed to see and refused to stay quiet about it, Darrel said, his voice breaking. He died because he asked questions, because he wouldn't follow illegal orders, because he was a good man who believed in doing the right thing. He held up the dog tags, let them catch the light. These are all I have left of him, these tags and the truth he risked everything to preserve. Today, that truth is finally being told. My brother's death meant something. His sacrifice meant something. And every other crew member who died in illegal operations, who was erased from the record, who was forgotten, they meant something too. Cassidy stepped forward then, her teacher's voice clear and strong. Our father didn't abandon us when he bought this helicopter. He taught us what matters most: truth, honor, keeping promises to the people you love. He taught us that some things are worth any cost. Trevor added, "We're proud of him, and we're proud of our uncle, who we never got to meet, but who left us a legacy of courage." The questions came rapid fire after that. Darrel answered what he could, deferred to Phyllis for details about the investigation, stayed focused on Kenny's story rather than the larger political implications. Patricia Granger spoke too, her voice shaking as she talked about her brother Jeffrey. Roy Callahan described his son's disappearance. Other families had sent statements, their words read aloud by Phyllis, a chorus of grief and anger finally given voice. By evening, the story had spread across every major news network. Social media exploded, with reactions, outrage at the government, sympathy for the families, demands for accountability. Hashtags trended. Editorials were written. The Defense Department issued a terse no comment that only fueled more speculation. Congressional representatives began calling for investigations. Senator Morrison from Nebraska demanded a full accounting of covert operations during that period. Representative Chen from California, a veteran herself, introduced a resolution to declassify documents related to missing helicopter crews. The Pentagon held its own press conference, a carefully worded statement about reviewing historical records and taking all allegations seriously without acknowledging any wrongdoing. The CIA refused to comment at all, citing national security. But the evidence was too strong to dismiss. Gloria had certified the flight recorder's authenticity. Audio experts confirmed the voices. Military historians verified the operational details. The story had credibility that couldn't be easily undermined. Veterans organizations mobilized. The American Veterans Foundation issued a statement supporting the family's quest for truth. The VFW called for congressional hearings. Men who'd served in Vietnam and knew about operations that had never been officially acknowledged began coming forward with their own stories. The backlash came too, as Hugh had warned. Right-wing media outlets accused Darrel of undermining national security. Former intelligence officers appeared on cable news, claiming the evidence was manufactured. Anonymous sources suggested the whole thing was a hoax designed to damage the military's reputation. Darrel received death threats via email and phone. Someone spray-painted "traitor" on his garage door. Cassidy's school received calls demanding she be fired. Trevor was confronted at his construction site by men who accused him of dishonoring veterans. But for every attack, there were 10 messages of support. Letters arrived from families across the country, thanking Darrel for his courage. Veterans stopped him on the street to shake his hand. Donations poured into a legal defense fund that Floyd had set up without asking permission. The town of Millbrook rallied around them completely now. Mrs. Kowalski, who'd crossed the street to avoid Darrel months ago, organized a prayer vigil at the church. Pete Haverman not only brought his truck back to Darrel's garage, but convinced half a dozen other customers to do the same. On Sunday evening, the 60 Minutes segment aired. 20 million people watched as Kenny's story was told in full, complete with the audio from the flight recorder, interviews with the families, and damning evidence of government cover-ups that had lasted decades. The segment ended with a shot of the helicopter in the hangar, Kenny's dog tags hanging from the pilot's seat, and Darrel's quiet words, "I just wanted my brother to be remembered, to be honored for what he really was, a hero who died telling the truth." By Monday morning, congressional hearings had been scheduled. The Department of Defense announced a formal review of all MIA cases from the Vietnam era, and the American Veterans Foundation called Darrel with an offer that would change everything. The call came from Director Harold Ashford of the American Veterans Foundation, his voice warm and respectful. "Mr. Wynn, we've been following your story. What you've done, what your brother did, it matters to us. It matters to a lot of people." Darrel sat at his kitchen table, the phone pressed to his ear, exhausted from days of interviews and attention. "Thank you. That means a lot. We'd like to do more than just thank you," Ashford continued. "Your brother's sacrifice, your dedication to uncovering the truth, it represents the best of what we try to honor. We want to establish scholarships in Captain Kenneth Wynn's name. Full-ride scholarships for both of your children, to any school they choose." Darrel's throat closed. "Mr. Wynn, I'm here," Darrel managed. That's incredibly generous, but it's not generosity, it's justice. Your children shouldn't have suffered because you did the right thing, and your brother's legacy should include helping the next generation. Will you accept?" Darrel looked across the kitchen to where Cassidy and Trevor sat at the counter, watching him with curious expressions. He thought about the college fund, about the choice that had torn his family apart, about Kenny's letter saying to tell their parents he died doing his duty. "Yes," he said. "Yes, we accept. Thank you." When he told them, Cassidy burst into tears. Trevor just stared, processing, then pulled his father into a fierce hug that said everything words couldn't. "Dad," Cassidy whispered, "you gave us our future back. You gave us more than that." The government's response came 3 days later. The Department of Defense issued a formal statement, carefully worded but significant. They acknowledged irregularities in operations during the 1973 period. They reclassified Kenny and 16 other crew members from MIA to Kia killed in action, finally, officially recognizing their deaths. More importantly, they issued an apology. Brief, legalistic, but real. The department regrets the circumstances surrounding these service members' deaths and the incomplete information provided to their families. These individuals died serving their country, and their sacrifice deserves full recognition and honor. It wasn't everything. It didn't name the people responsible or acknowledge the illegal operations explicitly, but it was admission, acknowledgement, a crack in the wall of denial that had stood for 30 years. Congressional hearings followed in February. Darrel testified, as did Patricia Granger and Roy Callahan. Gloria presented technical analysis of the flight recorder. Phyllis described her investigation. Former military personnel who'd served in the region during that period provided context, carefully dancing around what they could and couldn't say about classified operations. The Pentagon officials who testified were defensive, evasive, hiding behind classifications and national security. But the evidence was overwhelming. Even the most skeptical senators couldn't dismiss it. By March, reform legislation had been introduced, requirements for transparency with families of missing service members, declassification timelines for historical operations, oversight of covert activities involving military personnel. It wouldn't pass quickly, might not pass at all, but the conversation had changed. Kenny's name was added to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, along with the 16 other crew members whose deaths had been reclassified. A ceremony was held on a cold April morning, attended by hundreds of family members, veterans and supporters. Darrel stood before the wall, running his fingers over the carved letters of his brother's name, and finally felt something like peace. Kenny wasn't forgotten anymore. His story had been told. His sacrifice had meant something. The helicopter itself became a symbol. The Smithsonian requested it for their collection, wanting to preserve it as part of an exhibit on Vietnam War covert operations. But Darrel had a different idea. Working with the American Veterans Foundation, they created a traveling memorial. The helicopter would tour the country, stopping at cities and towns, accompanied by an exhibit telling Kenny's story and the stories of other forgotten service members. It would educate, honor, and ensure that the truth wouldn't be buried again. The first stop was Grand Island, Nebraska, where Kenny's name had been on the local memorial for 30 years. Now his helicopter sat in the town square for a week, thousands coming to see it, to learn, to remember. Darrel gave talks at schools, his calm voice telling Kenny's story to students who hadn't been born when the Vietnam War ended. He talked about courage, about truth, about keeping promises even when the cost seemed too high. Trevor enrolled at the University of Nebraska, studying aerospace engineering with a focus on helicopter systems. He wanted to understand the machines that had carried his uncle, to honor him by mastering the technology. Cassidy started her master's program in education, writing her thesis on teaching difficult histories, how to help students understand complex moral questions through personal stories. Preston, Cassidy's fiancé, had struggled with the attention and controversy at first, but he'd come around. He'd seen how the truth had healed Darrel's family, had brought them closer together than they'd been in years. At their wedding in June, held in the small Millbrook church, he acknowledged Darrel in his speech. "I'm marrying into a family that taught me something important," Preston said. "That integrity isn't just a word. It's a choice you make every day, even when the cost is high, even when people think you're crazy. My father-in-law is the most honorable man I know." The college fund was gone, spent on a rusted helicopter. But the scholarships would cover more than that money ever could have. And more importantly, Cassidy and Trevor had gained something no amount of money could buy: a deeper understanding of their father, their uncle, and what it means to stand for something that matters. On a quiet evening in July, the three of them sat on Darrel's porch, watching the sun set over the Nebraska plains. The helicopter was on tour in Texas. The media attention had finally died down. Life was returning to something like normal, though nothing would ever be quite the same. "Do you think Uncle Kenny knew," Trevor asked, "that someday you'd find what he left behind?" Darrel thought about it, about his brother hiding evidence in a helicopter, about faith and hope, and the bonds between brothers. "I think he hoped," Darrel said finally. "I think he believed someone would care enough to look, and he was right." 6 months later, Darrel stood in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, surrounded by artifacts of aviation history. The helicopter had completed its tour, visiting 32 cities across the country, seen by more than 500,000 people. Now it had found its permanent home. The exhibition hall was crowded for the dedication ceremony. Veterans in their dress uniforms, families of the fallen, members of Congress, journalists who'd covered the story. Darrel spotted familiar faces: Floyd, who'd closed the hardware store for the day to make the trip; Hugh Brennan, who'd helped guide them through the dangerous waters of government secrecy; Gloria Hartley, whose expertise had unlocked the flight recorder's secrets; Phyllis Kendrick, whose reporting had brought the truth to light; and his family. Cassidy stood beside Preston, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly, their first child, due in spring. Trevor had brought his girlfriend Amy, a fellow engineering student who understood his passion for aviation. They flanked Darrel as the museum director approached the podium. "Today, we honor not just the service members who gave their lives," the director said, "but also the families who never stopped searching for the truth. This helicopter represents both the darkness of government secrecy and the light of one man's determination to honor his brother's memory." The crowd applauded. Darrell felt Cassidy squeeze his arm. The memorial plaque had been mounted on the helicopter's fuselage, polished bronze bearing 17 names. Kenneth Wynn headed the list, followed by his crew and the other service members whose deaths had been reclassified, whose families had finally received answers. Captain Kenneth Wynn, and these men died in service to their country, the inscription read. They were silenced in death, but speak now through the courage of those who refuse to forget them. May their sacrifice remind us that truth, however buried, will always find its way to light. When it was Darrell's turn to speak, he approached the podium slowly, feeling every one of his 63 years. But he also felt lighter than he had in decades, unburdened by the weight of unanswered questions. "I'm not a public speaker," he began, his mechanic's hands gripping the podium. "I fix cars in a small Nebraska town. I raised 2 kids. I've lived a quiet life, but I had a brother who was extraordinary, a brother who saw wrong and couldn't stay silent, a brother who knew that speaking truth might cost him everything, and he spoke it anyway." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "For 30 years, I carried the weight of not knowing, of sensing something was wrong but having no way to prove it. That weight nearly crushed me. It affected every relationship, every decision. I was stuck in 1973, unable to move forward because I couldn't accept what I'd been told." Darrell looked at the helicopter, its restored metal gleaming under the museum lights. "When I spent my children's college fund on this machine, everyone thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had, a little. But sometimes you have to risk everything for something that matters. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong." Cassidy was crying quietly. Trevor's jaw was set in that way. Darrell recognized fighting emotion, staying strong. "My brother left me a trail. He believed someone would follow it, even if it took 30 years. He believed in family, in truth, in the idea that the right thing would eventually prevail. And he was right." Darrell pulled Kenny's dog tags from his pocket. He carried them everywhere now, a talisman and a reminder. These tags sat behind a pilot's seat for 3 decades, waiting to be found. They represent a promise kept. Kenny promised to tell the truth, and he did, even from beyond the grave. "I promised not to believe the lies, and I didn't." He looked out at the crowd, at all the people whose lives had been touched by this story. This isn't just about one helicopter or one man. It's about all the forgotten, all the erased, all the inconvenient truths that powerful people try to bury. It's about refusing to accept easy answers when your heart tells you there's more to the story. And it's about the fact that love for family, for country, for truth, is more powerful than any cover-up. The applause was thunderous. Veterans stood, saluting, families wept, and Darrell stepped back from the podium, his duty finally done. After the ceremony, people approached him, some to thank him, others to share their own stories of missing loved ones and unanswered questions. He listened to each one, knowing now that his brother's story had opened doors for others to seek their own truths. As the crowd thinned, Darrell found himself alone with the helicopter one last time. He placed his hand on the fuselage, felt the cold metal beneath his palm, and whispered words only Kenny could hear. "We did it, brother. They know now. They all know what you were, what you did, what you sacrificed. You're not forgotten. You never will be again." He felt a hand on his shoulder, Trevor, standing beside him. "You okay, Dad?" Darrell nodded. "Yeah, I'm okay. Better than okay." Cassidy joined them, the 3 of them standing together before the memorial, a family that had been fractured, then broken, then healed, stronger than before. "Thank you," Cassidy said softly, "for teaching us what really matters, for showing us that some things are worth any cost." "Your uncle taught me that," Darrell replied. "I just finally listened." They left the museum as evening settled over Washington, the helicopter remaining behind to tell its story to future generations. Darrell didn't look back. He didn't need to anymore. The past had been honored, the truth had been told, and the future, for the first time in 30 years, felt open and bright. As they walked toward the parking lot, Trevor said, "You know what I've been thinking? When Cassidy's baby is born, if it's a boy." "Kenneth," Cassidy finished. "We've already decided. Kenneth Preston, Kenny for short." Darrel stopped walking, overcome. His daughter smiled through tears. "He deserves to live on," she said. "Not just in museums and memorials, but in family, in love, in the next generation." And Darrel understood then that this was the greatest legacy, not the headlines or the reforms or the scholarships, but this, a name carried forward, a story told to children who would tell it to their own children, truth preserved not in metal and glass, but in the living hearts of family.